تحياتي متابعينا، أهلا وسهلا فيكم بحلقة جديدة وخاصة من برنامج يلا. بحلقة اليوم رح نسلط الضوء على شخصية إيرانية لها وزن وتاريخ ويراها الكثيرون داخل إيران وخارجها كشخصية قد يكون لها دور بارز في مستقبل إيران. رحبوا معي بولي العهد الإيراني الأمير رضا بهلوي، وسنناقش مع الأمير رضا بهلوي المظاهرات والحراك المستمر في إيران ابتداء من حراك إمرأة حياة وحرية، كما ورؤيته للميليشيات المتطرفة التابعة للنظام الإيراني ودور المخرب في المنطقة، وهجمات السابع من أكتوبر الإرهابية من قبل حماس على إسرائيل، والمواجهات الحالية مع ميليشيا الحوثيين، ورؤيته للسلام بين إسرائيل وإيران المستقبلية. كما سنتحدث عن تطلعات الشعب الإيراني لمستقبل ومرحلة ما بعد نظام خامنئي. لمعرفة كل هذه التفاصيل تابعونا في هذا اللقاء الخاص من برنامج يلا. Thank you so much for joining the Yalla show, Your Excellency.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You are the son of Iran, and you have a personal history that's very tied to Iran, and it must be very hard living away from your homeland. Can you tell us about your memories in Iran, and what do you miss the most?
Of course, I was in my country until the day I graduated from high school, so I was about 17 and a half at the time I left the country in the summer of 1978 with the objective of coming to an Air Force pilot training program in the US and going back home, which of course never occurred because of the revolution. So I have many fond memories of my countries because I was able to travel many parts of the country. I enjoyed nature, I enjoyed interacting with people on a very incognito basis as opposed to outside of my official functions as the Crown Prince. So it was a very interesting experience for me growing up as a young boy and later on as a teenager. And you know, it's the kind of memories that gets etched in someone's mind. And yes, it's very tough when you are forced into exile out of no choice of your own. But then again, it's not that you are necessarily separated because all those memories and the connection exist. And over all these years, 43 years and counting, you know, I was able to maintain a contact with my fellow compatriots. So it's not that I was detached from what was happening. And of course, with the advent of social media, it's almost like you're there because we're constantly getting you know, all sorts of feedback and comments and reactions, and a dialogue really exists. So in that way, I didn't feel really separated.
You are the most prominent opposition member to the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and you've said that your life's mission would be accomplished when Iran is free. How do you get from today to there?
Well, there's obviously a discipline to follow in terms of social disobedience, civil disobedience as a means of non-violent means to that end. If we can benefit in terms of what the outside world can do to maximize and empower the Iranian people, it's a two-pronged approach. One is to impose maximum pressure on the regime. For instance, the oil sanctions that have been called for but not really implemented has created a situation that the regime has had more access to money. What do you think it's going to be spent on? It's going to be spent on Hamas, it's going to be spent on Hezbollah, it's going to be spent on the Houthis in Yemen. There's a lot more diplomatic pressure that they can exert on the regime by forbidding the travel or restricting the travel or even expelling their diplomats. There are many elements associated with the regime that are running all sorts of businesses for money laundering or finding loopholes that ultimately finances the IRGC or other elements like that, which ties to the maximum support aspect of things.
What do you mean by maximum support?
There are ways of empowering a society that has to face such level of repression by giving them more means to be able to have a more equal playing field. One of the most elements that has often been a concern for our activists, and this is at home, was not to be cut off from the world. The regime has tried everything for years now to curtail communications. I think labor strike funds is very important. That can be financed. Part of the solution could be a lot of the frozen assets of the regime, which is after all the Iranian people's money, could be repurposed in that direction. What I'm trying to say is that the Iranian people are putting up the fight, but it would be so much easier and less costly to them if they knew that they were not alone in these struggles.
If the Iranian people succeed in removing the Iranian regime, what happens next?
Well, again, it's a very critical question of making sure that the quicker path to an opportunity for people's representative to debate the future, it has to be an atmosphere of stability and calm, which is one of the reasons I've always called for a process of civil disobedience, because I think the greatest X factor in helping us through the transition and maintaining law and order are the bulk of the military and paramilitary forces that are in place in Iran right now. If they can find in their majority a survival beyond this regime and a place for themselves,
yes,
then you're not bringing in a maximizing chance of stability post-regime. The mistake that occurred in Iraq in post-Saddam Hussein was a disaster. Half of the forces that were sent back home ended up becoming ISIS fighters. We don't want that scenario to repeat itself in Iran. But there has to be a calculation of how do you incorporate the bulk of these elements so they are not in no man's land. And I've always said they need to join with the people and become their shield of protection against the remnants of the regime who are trying desperately to hold on to power by creating even more repression.
Do you see a role for yourself in a future Iran?
My focus has been only to see that I can help a transition to a democratic future in Iran. And if I am somebody with the influence and trust that people have, reason more for me to focus on this role of being able to bring in the maximum number of people who are like-minded, a coalition of the willing, if you will, to make sure that we can have a phase of transition that leads to the ultimate desire of the Iranian people. Right now, we're in the phase of struggle to overthrow this regime, only because we know that as long as this regime is in place, none of the hopes that Iran has in terms of freedom, in terms of democracy, in terms of self-determination, in terms of putting any end to any kind of discrimination will not disappear until this regime actually goes. And then we fall into a period of transition. So what is the plan in forming that transition? Bring in the amount of stability and security so we can in fact go through a process of electing a national assembly. That National Assembly would debate the future laws and constitutions of the country, and at the end of the day, a referendum will be a way for people to ultimately decide that future. I see this role to be my critical role at this phase, and that's my only focus at this point, is to be able to help this transition.
Let's go back to the murder of Mahsa Amini, which sparked the Women Life Freedom movement. How significant do you see this movement compared to previous movements?
It would be unfair for us to say that the resistance of Iranian women is new. From the very beginning, the regime started an immediate discrimination. Exactly. Its first victim were the Iranian women, who immediately became second-class citizens. But the reason why the impact of Mahsa's death was a trigger point is because today the world had had enough with so much repression, because they have heard in these past 40 years all the discriminations that has occurred against various Iranian citizens, including women. And that was a trigger point. Maybe media coverage, maybe social media had a role to play. But it would be unfair to say that it started last year. Last year was a culmination point that people had enough, and it was an element that galvanized the whole nation. She was a daughter of Iran. It was not perceived to be a Kurdish thing or a religious thing. It was a matter of a revolt. Now, it has its ebbs and flows, clearly, because you're dealing with a very repressive regime.
Yes.
But again, reason more to tell the world, listen, if you don't invest in something that is in your own interest, look at the way we put an end to apartheid in South Africa. Look at the way there was an end to the communist rule in the Soviet Union. Did it happen entirely by itself? Did dissidents and activists in South Africa or Russia or other countries were able to do it all by themselves, or wasn't there some serious level of international support? The same scenario now applies to what we are facing today in our struggle for freedom in Iran.
Our audience in the MENA region might not be aware of the Islamic Republic in Iran is actually not very Islamic. Of course, in fact, there are the Sunni Muslims who are very persecuted against, including Shia as well. What can you tell our viewers about the regime and how the Iranian regime treats Muslims in Iran?
Two leaders specifically made statements about the fact that if this regime calls itself Islamic, then we are not Muslims. One was the late President Sadat, and the other one was the late King of Morocco, Hassan II. Mm-hmm. That was merely a year in the inception of the regime. And since then, we have seen the level of discrimination that this regime has exercised over its own citizenry, not to mention beyond its borders. When I look at today of people who perhaps are representative of that, in the case of Fatemeh Sepehri, who's a pious religious Shiite who has been incarcerated and is a political prisoner, literally, or Maulavi Abdul Hamid, who is a leading Sunni leader in Baluchistan in Iran. They'll be the first one to tell you how this regime has been, in fact, anti-Islamic. Bottom line, what we want to get at is, and I think that's something that our entire region needs to consider. When you look at countries where different faiths were able to propagate and prosper, it's under the guarantee of freedom of religion, but also in the guarantee of separation of religion from state. These are the fundamental principles and prerequisites to have a democracy that is justice for all and can guarantee equality for anyone and everyone, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of faith, regardless of political orientation. If that is not the backbone and the basis of society in terms of its governance, then you pretty much are killing the maximum potential that citizens in that country could have. I think Iranians will understand that the minute you eliminate all of these elements of discrimination, and on the contrary, give every citizen equal chance for participation and representation, that not only maximizes their chances for a better life, but it gives them the incentive to do their utmost for their country, because that's finally a system they can believe in, as opposed to a system they're trying to fly away from. Although, again, I want to say that today's generation of young Iranians are much, much closer and far more aware and much more determined than any preceding generation in the past 40 years since the regime's inception. And that's what gives me hope, because I can see that they have gone through a learning curve at a very, very high cost. Only last night, another young Iranian was executed by the regime. And God knows how many more of these executions we'll have to witness. We cannot put up with this any longer. Iranians are tired of it. And I think the world needs to finally recognize that this is an opportunity to bring a lasting change that will change the shape of the entire region.
What will that change mean to Iran's neighbors?
Well, first and foremost, what neighbors do in a spirit of good neighborliness is to bring in an element of peace, of stability, of cooperation, and seeking to work together to address many issues that are not limited to our respective countries, which is a regional issue. You know, I mentioned earlier the water crisis. This is not just limited to Iran. We have similar problems in Syria, in Iraq, even in Yemen or other countries in the region. I think that spirit of regional cooperation, whether it is with the UAE or the Saudis or the Egyptians or the Lebanese or the Jordanians or our neighborhood in general, that means we can put so much more resources to areas that can improve the lives of our citizens, healthcare, retirement pension plans, education, what have you, rather than spending it on armament and conflict and sapping the budget of the country that could otherwise be allocated to other projects. We can have a common cooperation of defense and security together as a regional group. So the mentality of being challenging and being instigating, fomenting trouble is the nature of this regime. It is not the national interest of the Iranian people. So what I'm saying is that a national government that is truly representative of the Iranian people's will seek to have the best possible neighborly relationship with our Arab neighbors, with Israel, with Turkey, with Pakistan, with anybody in our own neighborhood, because we can maximize the potential for enrichment of our citizens' life by working together